ENOCHIAN 2025 was a blast, and thank you so much to Dr. Justin Sledge for bringing that rare, true and faithful relation copy of Dee's original ENOCHIAN work. We are proud to now announce ENOCHIAN 2026, November 6th through 8th in Austin, Texas. 2026 membership includes access to our workshop this spring, also in Austin. We will have multiple rooms, a workshop room, a green room, a dining hall, a whole building downtown. But 2025 is not done yet. Our members still have access to this December 6th, 2025, a full-day workshop with Dr. Terry Burns and Frater RC on the practice of ENOCHIAN magic, online and in person from 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. Actually wrote apparently a paper on the Dies Monis Hieroglyphica, so it's interesting to think that he was probably extremely familiar with John Dee and the Enochian system to the extent that you could be at that time. And they were dealing with, again, limited sources such as the Merritt Casaubon's True and Faithful Relation, which was the main source for most people who didn't have access to the British Library, British Museum at the time. I would be so fascinated to hear what his deeper thoughts were on the Enochian system, but I don't think we'll ever know that. What we do know, of course, from already studying his magnum opus, of course, he was sort of opposed to sorcery and magic or manipulation of elemental forces for mundane effect or wondrous effect, but a big fan, as we know, of theurgy and divine sacred magic. So that's very interesting. And I actually think, now that I know quite a bit more about him, because again, it's been very hard to find out a lot about this man for a long time, and partly due to the fact that most of the stuff written about him is usually written in German or French or something like that. And then, of course, it takes a while for that stuff to get translated. There's like a huge 2-volume collection / biography of his work and essays by people on him that's been out in German for ages, but still untranslated. Maybe ChatGPT can do that, because I don't think anyone's been able to translate, even tackle a 1,200-page 2-volume gargantuan couple tomes that cover so much of the scope of his life and work. So there's just really one little book, and there's a bunch of stuff against him. A lot of the anthroposophists and Waldorf school, Rudolf Steiner followers, sort of have waged polemics against him for a long time, since he moved on from anthroposophy in the external sense, in the societal sense, and converted to Catholicism. That was kind of a shock to a lot of people, despite the fact, interestingly, that Rudolf Steiner himself was a Roman Catholic. And while Steiner railed a lot against Jesuitism, like in the political machinations of the Jesuits, so Steiner was against the Jesuitism political stuff, but was Roman Catholic. And in anthroposophy, you've always been able to be any religion. They had no religious requirements, though obviously it's not a shock to imagine that they were mostly from Lutheran backgrounds, being a German and Austrian origin, original movement, and of course Protestant, therefore. And Tomberg was, one of the greatest things about him is, of course, that he was born in 1900. So whenever you're reading about his life and the years, you always know how old he is. So 1900 to 1972. One second. All right, who wants to hear about a crazy life? Do you want to hear about a crazy life? Born in 1900. There's no notes for this, so I'm just going to tell you the main points, because, well, that's the most interesting stuff. I mean, the details are interesting, fascinating, and I'm going to avoid saying names right now, because unless you see them on the screen, they might be distracting. I'll just say I'll describe the people, and Nikolai Beluzhnitov is a name I had to read so much, but I got it confused with sometimes some of the other really intense Slavic and Russian names, and it's a lot of fun. But let's not be distracting and just get a sense of what his life was about, because that really does shine through and in the core of his work. So he was studying law when he was 17 in Russia, and born in St. Petersburg. And it seems like his family were sort of lower Russian nobility, not in any significant way, but they were able to go to court, and he was getting educated and all of that. But then in 1917, they had to flee to Estonia, which is where originally they were from. They had to escape the Russian Revolution, which is just a shocking and interesting start to, of course, his life. He was reading a lot of tarot writers and a lot of Rosicrucian writers while he was a teenager in St. Petersburg. I mean, before the Russian Revolution, it's hard for us to even comprehend how, use this word with caveat, but how fantastic Russia was. Don't take that the wrong way. But just it was this empire of culture and learning, and just an epicenter. It's just not, it wasn't the austere Soviet bloc that most of us grew up sort of experiencing it or hearing about it or thinking about it as, right? It's like when you watch the old period pieces and you see these Russian nobles come with all their culture. It's always a little, for me growing up, it was always a little shocking because it was just so different from like the Soviet USSR, which is what was all over ever present in our lives. So they fled, and in Estonia, the Red Army, of course, pursued people like that. So they pursued him. They caught his mom in the street. She wouldn't give up her husband and him, so they assassinated her. And that was probably one of the first really significant turning points in his life. That happened when he was basically 18. And it's pointed out that's a lunar nodal return. So every 8 years, 9 months, and 7 days, the moon returns goes around the sun. So I don't know why this author included that sole astrological detail in Tomberg's life, but he does. It's almost sort of like the way we look at our Saturn return. The big one's at 28. When you're 28, 29, you get your first big Saturn return. But looking at the lunar nodal thing was interesting because there's these tides in Valentin Tomberg's life that seem to connect with that. Definitely things change. If you think of your own life, maybe in terms of 18-year cycles, and you might see some sort of, I mean, there's not that many of them that we get, of course, but we get a few, more than Saturn returns. So that's interesting. Basically, he was sort of on the run his entire life. Not really, but living through all those wars and all those periods, of course, just, yeah. There was no stability, as we all know, in the 20th century in Europe at really any point. So that's a fascinating aspect there. He kept studying law, and in Estonia worked got eventually good jobs working in the postal service. He spoke so many languages. Growing up in St. Petersburg, they spoke German, Estonian, Russian, and I believe French. And by the end of his life, he was fluent in about nine languages and competent in a bunch of others. He was able to focus and learn things really quickly, like, Dutch. He picked up. He went from being a beginner in Dutch to fluent in it very rapidly when he lived in the Netherlands. Now I was thinking about that, and why aren't we all better at languages? I always wish I was, and I'm not bad, but part of it, I was realizing they had a lot more time. The next most interesting thing that happened to him in his life was he married one of his parents' friends, who was a Polish countess, something like that. Yeah, who was 19 years older than him when he was a teenager, and that was a marriage of convenience. And probably there's, again, though I don't know the details, yeah, I know it's a little odd. It gets way weirder. Oh, you're in for a treat. My guess is that it had something to do with either she's gonna die or you're gonna die, and they needed to all team up. And especially with the difficulties that sometimes women had in even maintaining access to their own money and finances and land, if they had it, right? If they didn't remarry, it was very possible you could actually have that all taken away from you, especially in the turmoil, the turmoil of when the USSR and the Soviet bloc formed and slowly encroached over Europe. It ate Estonia. He wasn't in Estonia for that many years before eventually, of course, Estonia was incorporated into the USSR as a Soviet republic. But he married this older woman, and they survived, and they continued to sort of move as the different wars and armies followed them around Europe. Not long, and after 10 years of being married to her, here's the kicker. After 10 years of being married to her, his friend and his friend's wife, Nikolai, they got divorced, and he married his friend's ex-wife. Well, his ex-friend married another woman. And he kept his first wife, the 20-year-old older woman, around with his new family and his new wife as the grandmother to his new kid, who was born the day after he married the woman. So he had to actually claim the kid because under law, it was technically, I guess, a bastard being born the day after the wedding. But that was very interesting. And that, as humorous as that sort of sounds, and because it's crazy, but I imagine that a lot of that did have to do with survival in a way that we can barely imagine. I mean, none of us have had to ever flee a totalitarian regime, I don't think. Not yet, at least. Oh, God. Oh, God. So they continue fleeing. And now but the divorce and the marrying of this younger woman, that would probably be the inciting incident that led to Tomberg's later fallout with the Anthroposophical Society and Marie Steiner, Rudolf Steiner's widow. And so that was much down the road, because people were upset about it a little bit, and that makes sense. But on closer inspection, there might be more going on than just something like that. Because, you don't really throw over your friends just because something like that, right? Especially someone you have really close connection with. You don't necessarily just toss them out of your entire society because they get divorced and married someone else. Especially even back then. I mean, think about it in terms of the 20s and 30s. This is when he was starting to be really active. Is in his early 20s with the Anthroposophical Society in Estonia. He became the head of it. He had written to Steiner as a teenager, but Steiner never wrote back, as far as we know. The letters to Steiner are interesting, but eventually he made contact with Marie Steiner and worked a lot in the Estonian Anthroposophical Society. So he moved on from the tarot and the other more occult stuff, though that's a tricky one to say, because occultism was sort of differently defined back then. Now, it was less stigmatized in many ways as a word. Yeah, so he started doing amazing amount of teaching and writing, and that's no shocker to us, of course, because we're enjoying his opus. But for the first couple of 20 years, like first 15, 20 years, just putting out and teaching a lot of the curriculum that Rudolf Steiner and the Anthroposophical Society were promoting. And now, one of the most interesting things about this period is this is the period in which Steiner died, in the 20s. And the 20s, of course, were roaring 20s. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, the swinging. It's probably now is probably the swinging time since dating apps. This is the swinging 20s, 100 years later. The roaring 20s, dating app swinging 20s. Oh my God. With Steiner's death, and Steiner didn't leave a will because he had consulted with some friends and given the whole idea behind anthroposophy, and the core tenet of Rudolf Steiner's teachings was always about personal freedom, which is one of the reasons, of course, he would have a problem with things like the Jesuitism of Roman Catholicism and any kind of top-down structure that would oppress or limit the freedom of man. It's why the Waldorf school system doesn't treat the child like a blank slate. That's more the Montessori thing. Even though these schools were often operating out of the same buildings, they had two very diametrically different methods of understanding what the human soul is, and Steiner believed it just needed to express itself freely and not be preconditioned with just hard facts and science and all that sort of like a flashcard method of education. Steiner didn't think that. He's like, just give it space and it will show you what it is. The human soul will reveal itself to you. So given he left no will, there was a big question of who's going to be the main sort of leading star of anthroposophy. And it was very quickly becoming apparent, even in his 30s, in the 1930s, because that's it's born in 1900. It was clear that it was him, and a lot of people saw that. A lot of people thought he was what Steiner was speaking of as the incarnation or the reincarnation of the Maitreya Buddha. So a lot of people thought that's what he was, and they saw him as that, and they saw him as that up to in the 90s. Anthroposophists and people who had known him were still writing that they consider him to have been the one Steiner spoke about as the successor. However, what happened with anthroposophy, despite even the fallout between Valentin Tomberg and Marie Steiner and the other heads of the Anthroposophical Society in Dornach, Germany, where the Goetheanum is, it's the beautiful building that you can check out online. Just when he might have started to get favor and take a leading role in anthroposophy, the Nazi Party declared it illegal and outlawed anthroposophy. So That was done. It was just done entirely. And even a lot of countries preemptively then, like the Netherlands, shut down so that it wouldn't be made illegal in those countries. That way they could sort of surreptitiously keep meeting together, and they're not doing anything illegal because they closed the door. They closed it down early. But yeah, Nazism shut that down along with most things, Masonry, the OTO. Yeah. They shut all those things down. So they had to flee Estonia with his wife and his grandma wife and the new wife, and the new wife was already an anthroposophist, so that the older woman was obviously, of course, a marriage convenience for finances for him, security for her, and then she became a sort of grandma figure to them. And he expressed this to Rudolf Steiner's wife when she questioned him about what the hell was going on with this marrying this woman she knew who's another anthroposophist, and her husband was an anthroposophist, and they all stayed friends throughout the rest of their life, it seems. And yeah, he sort of said it was a personal matter, and that was that. The beginning story of his life would make a fascinating little miniseries or something like that. It's just really interesting. And more details to come on some of the particular dramas. But yeah, they escaped Estonia when it was incorporated into the Soviet Union, and then the movement from they tried to go to Germany, but there was problems because Hitler was in charge. And it's really interesting to see the diary entries in Tomberg and people like Rudolf Steiner about Hitler, because even as soon as Hitler was in power, they never wrote his name as like Hitler in the diaries. You'll see, if you look at old diary entries, you'll see H, and that's very common because people knew sort of from the get-go that there was, maybe this is not a name you want to be writing down much in your diary, especially when sharing your actual thoughts about the man. So none of these guys liked him. If you hear occultists today talking about like, oh, there's the secret Nazi undercurrent to occultists, no, there's occultic undercurrents to Nazism, and Tomberg wrote an entire book on it, which would be such an amazing sort of predecessor to my own doctoral supervisor, Nicholas Goodrick Clark's 3 major works on the occult roots of Nazism. However, we don't know. I think it looks like it was destroyed or lost. So we'll never have Tomberg's book on what he saw as, and so his interpretation, this wouldn't be like the academic books my supervisor wrote. This would be like his insights, his clairvoyant things. You'll notice they never talk about their own actual clairvoyance very often. Steiner and Tomberg and all these people, they didn't believe you should talk about that stuff. They also were very opposed to things like confirming reincarnations and stuff like that. They considered it was every time in anthroposophical circles, teachers have started affirming reincarnation statuses amongst members, things go bad fast. There's a reason I've always been a little allergic to that sort of mentality, and people saying I'm this person, I'm that person, and stuff like that. Because I mean, what if, even if it is true, it's just the repercussions never seem to work out very well. And Tomberg dabbled a bit in that. He would dabble a bit in that, but his detractors used that to really, really discredit and destroy him, and cause him to have to almost have to definitely have an ostensible break with anthroposophy eventually, after the Second World War, which is unfortunate. But from his diary notes, you can see even when he makes reference to like a picture of the apostles and which each of those people would be in his own circle, there's like a parenthetical note saying in principle, right? So more like these people in my life are playing these sort of roles. I'm not saying like my buddy Nikolai is John or Peter or Paul, like legitimately for real. No. In the Netherlands, where they moved and got set up through the Anthroposophical Society, and they got help to flee Estonia and live there, and they were supported by anthroposophists until he was able to get a job at the Estonian consulate, which he maintained as a secretary until the Nazis, of course, then took over Holland, and the Estonian consulate was also abolished as well because Estonia didn't exist anymore with the usurpation by the Soviet Republic, so he couldn't keep working at the consulate. And during those years, they were bad years. He did get out before the famous Dutch famine, the dark Dutch famine year of 44-45, end of the Second World War. They did get out before that, but up through that whole period, that's where they were sort of stuck, was in the Netherlands. And apparently there's an interesting account of the fact that they had so little food that him and his wife, they took up smoking, and that was the only time they did that, was because they were starving so much. And I thought that was like, man, like, it's a weird world in which you could find cigarettes but not food. That's a weird world, because like, especially these days with it's barely more, I don't know, prices and all that. Yeah. Okay. In the Netherlands, he had grown up and been born Lutheran, but in Russia, he got really into the Russian Orthodox Church. And so in the Netherlands, he pursued his relationship with that and brought his entire anthroposophical circle into the Russian Orthodoxy there. And there was only one little church, or a couple churches, with one priest who moved amongst them, Frater Dionysi, or Father Dionysi. And eventually one of Tomberg, that all ended very badly. When though Tomberg's son and them, they got confirmed and baptized and were partaking communion at the Russian Orthodox Church. But one of the women in his circle mentioned to Father Dionysi something about reincarnation. And Father Dionysi was inquired further, talked to Tomberg, and banned her from Eucharist, because he said, look, if you actually believe in reincarnation, then that means you don't really believe in the Eucharist. And then Tomberg took him to task and was very upset with this, because he said, look, there is no dogma in the Orthodoxy against reincarnation, just as like there isn't in Catholicism. There just isn't. And if you look at the stats these days, especially in America, it's over 25% of Roman Catholics believe in reincarnation. And given there's no dogma against it, it's sort of interesting to note that it is an underserved and underrepresented aspect of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, right? You'd think that maybe if the Catholic Church, if so many of their members believed in something that they didn't deny was real, they might talk about it a bit more. But you could blame the laity, you could blame the people for not speaking up more about it to the church. Tomberg constantly is talking about this idea of the church feeding from the beliefs, the community of believers, right? The body of Christ feeds into the churches, and that those ideas filter up and then come down in the form of transformation, rejuvenation, or change, or even in the case of Roman Catholicism, as papal infallibility, which Tomberg interprets as being a gesture that is begun from the people below, from the community of believers. And then after that belief becomes strong enough, it trickles up, and then the Pope says, yep, this is how it is. And that's why we would see that the last time, and one of only two times the Pope's ever used infallibility, was in the 50s, just in the 20th century. And that was to confirm the Assumption of Mary, the idea that Mary doctrinally was bodily assumed into heaven, just shot up there like Enoch and Jesus after his resurrection. The only other time before I think he spoke ex cathedra, from the throne, was, I believe, 1850s, and I think that was to declare that he's infallible when they speak that way. I think that's what the first one was, or maybe it was something else. Anyway, but I think it's an interesting idea that Tomberg's pointing out, that some of these ideas do come from the base of the church and not from a top-down thing. They do sort of move from down to up in a cycle and then back down again. If everyone believes Mary went bodily to heaven, then the Pope may as well say so. But just so, if people are all believing in reincarnation, why isn't the Pope talking about that? So Tomberg was upset that Father Dionysi denied the Eucharist because some of his congregants believed in reincarnation, which they did. And that is sort of sad. And Father Dionysi was very upset. He was stormed off and was like, they're all leaving, they're all leaving. Oh my God. But again, he banned someone from Eucharist just because she believes in something that she had every right to believe in. Yeah, that was a bad choice on his part. And he was probably very frazzled, because he was just the only Russian Orthodox priest probably in all of the Netherlands, quite possibly, given what's going on in Russia. And he had to move from The Hague back to like Amsterdam and to tend to different little small flocks. And yeah, that's sort of sad. There's a cool picture of him. I'll show you guys at some point. He looked like a cool guy, but too bad about the stuff. So they dabbled in the Russian Orthodoxy, but Tomberg never left the Russian Orthodoxy behind. Really, by the end of his life, he was, again, the idea we see in Meditations on the Tarot, the Ecclesia Universalis, the universal church. Tomberg didn't really become Roman Catholic in any exclusivist sense. He liked the idea and continued to take communion in both Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and was allowed to. And he also, of course, was still sort of a Lutheran. So he represented all the different forms of Christianity in himself, all as one, which theologians would have a field day with that way of thinking. But mystics and occultists and magicians, like, sort of like,
Perfect.
why can't I, and Rudolf Steiner pointed out many times that they're human beings, and Steiner, this is coming from anthroposophical thinking, again, the idea of a full self needing freedom and will and ownership of the expression of its authentic truth. Steiner said there's needs within that, and some of those are cultic needs and sacramental needs. We need ritual, we need structures and forms that give us community, connection to God horizontally, but also vertically. And we need that to stand at that intersection to be full people. And so the fact that you might need to go to this religion or this church or this place to get this need met, that was very fine with Steiner. He thought that was great. And we do see here, of course, the obvious trail of perennialism and the project of uniformity of thinking. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't have Protestant and Catholic Christians talking about the importance of the reincarnation of the Maitreya Buddha to their lives, right? You imagine being in a Christian church and hearing the sermon start talking about the second coming of the Buddha to preface the return of Christ? That would be you'd be like, what church did I come into here? Like, what did I miss something on the sign? I mean, it's kind of interesting. It was definitely the thinking I grew up with because of not only the transcendental meditation in my background and that whole Eastern impulse, but then growing up in anthroposophy. And Steiner was all about the return of Christ, which he believes already has begun, because Christ returns, as he says in the Gospels, in the clouds. But what Steiner says this means is that Christ returns on the etheric plane, in the etheric level, and returns, and that's a product of the blood of Christ from Golgotha seeping down the bottom of the cross, representing Christ's descent into hell, going through the 7 layers of the earth and rejuvenating the core of the earth throughout hundreds and thousands of years. So this is the idea of the return of the etheric Christ permeating the planet and transforming it. Interestingly, that's one of the reasons there's such a large ecological agenda in anthroposophy. Anthroposophy is very much about biodynamic farming and the theories around diet and connection to the earth. Of course, a lot of those people were anthroposophists or were vegetarians. Anthroposophy was big into that because Blavatsky was into that, but not all of them. Some of them had the opposite views, and yeah. So the etheric Christ is a constant theme. We don't see this in Meditations on the Tarot because Tomberg tried to distance himself in Meditations on the Tarot from anthroposophical language and stuff. But anytime you hear him see the phrase like Christian community, with the community like Christian capital C, but community small c, the anthroposophical church, its actual name is the Christian community. So priests priests in anthroposophy, which I nearly became one several times, but when who knows, I might yet, we'll see. But that church is called the Christian community. That's what it's called. So anytime Tomberg says Christian community, there's a subtle innuendo or throwback to the anthroposophical Christian church. And it's a very interesting church if you ever look into it. Yeah, they have their headquarters in Berlin, and one of the things I like about them is that they refuse to take advantage at any stage, even if they can, of nonprofit status. They believe churches should contribute to the, pay taxes and contribute to the common good. It shouldn't be exempt. I thought that was cool. Just a little tidbit about them. So yeah, the etheric Christ and the return of the etheric Christ, and this is presaged by the reincarnation of the Maitreya Buddha, who a lot of people thought Tomberg was. He said he wasn't. People asked him point blank if he was. He said no. And I'm pretty sure if that happens, it's considered a very significant thing. I think you You can't really just be it and deny being it in the ethos and the milieu of how these people would think about this sort of stuff, you know. I think there's like a profundity in asking that direct question, probably parallel to the kind of, you know, way in which people would ask Jesus if he was God, right? So you'd say, I am what you say I am, which is such a reversal of the Mount Sinai, right? I am that I am. It's like, I am what you say I am. And yeah, an interesting idea that has really underlied the last 2,000 years of the Piscean age, right? What are you? Well, whatever you say I am. And that's so different than the Aquarian current we're now entering into, of course, which has, believe it or not, a very strong authoritarian vibe. It also has a very strong androgynous vibe. But of course, we don't see indicators of either of those things today in our cultures at all. There's no rise of authoritarianism, androgyny. Fascinating parallel to modern times is in the beginning of the 20th century. So when Tomberg and Steiner, when Steiner was still alive, they were talking about this being the age of that they believed those first 30, 40 years would be the beginning of this huge revolution, and everyone was going to really understand what it meant to be in touch with the true higher self, which is represented in anthroposophy, but with the word I. The higher self is I, or even another word is the Greek word. What's the Greek word for I?
Ego.
Yeah, ego. I. And this is what throws a lot of modern occultists off when they go, wait, the ego is bad, right? The ego's, and it's like, why is the I, the basic statement of self, bad? And, you know, because there's all this baggage post psychology, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we started thinking about it more detailed when Tomberg encountered Jung, and he was very taken with it and very much loved that. But yeah, with Meditation on the Tarot, he distanced himself from a lot of the anthroposophical language and tried to incorporate Hermetic thought. He moved on from anthroposophy into Hermeticism in a very distinct way, believing that Hermeticism it's cute, believing that it was you know, then the actual better next step in a lot of regards. Of course, there's deep ties between Hermeticism and anthroposophy through not only Rosicrucianism and that whole thing, but just Steiner understood Hermeticism and understood Hermetic thought. Steiner met up with chief adepts of the Golden Dawn and gave them teachings. He probably wasn't too, I don't think he was too into what they were into. Certainly not too blown away by anything they were into. He probably saw them as I don't know. It's a tricky one, and this is a topic that needs more investigation, honestly. Nick Farrell's done the most work in analyzing it in his book on Robert Felkin, because Felkin's the one who really tracked down Steiner and then brought a lot of these anthroposophical things into the Golden Dawn. The aphorisms, the sayings that we have in the Golden Dawn, the daily rhythms, as they're called, that's directly from anthroposophy. And Crowley stole that without knowing it was from anthroposophy. Well, you see that with Hail to Thee, Thou who art Ra, and his rising. The adorations throughout the day in Thelema come from the ones in the Golden Dawn, which were directly extracted and created out of from the connection with the crossover with Rudolf Steiner. And of course, the rite of the etheric link, this idea that there's this etheric initiatory link passed in the Golden Dawn from chief adepts to chief adepts, so that they can create not new versions of the same order, but a new order, but in the lineage. So this is one of the nuances of Golden Dawn polity and spiritual generation that we don't talk about much, because again, it's so nitpicky. And how important is it? I don't know. A lot of people think it's very important, of course, if you have the etheric link or not. But Steiner's etheric link came from his teacher, Alois Mailander, or Master M, as he was often called. And Sam Robinson finally wrote a book on that, and that's interesting. I look forward to reading that at some point. But Master M was, according to Steiner, the reincarnation of Christian Rosenkreutz, and therefore, of course, that's how Steiner claims he was initiated by Christian Rosenkreutz himself. Yeah, there's the spiritual world just sort of sometimes it's really entertaining, isn't it? Like, how are you initiated? Like, it's like saying we were initiated. Imagine saying you're initiated directly by Jesus, right? Why? Because Jesus is reincarnated in all people. And I was initiated by all people because I'm a member of the human race. And when I was born, that was initiating me directly from Christ. So I am the next Christ. This stuff can spiral out of control real fast, real fast. It's kind of fun in a way, but yeah, you go. That's why it's nice to keep your wits about you. Yeah, so Amsterdam was taken. They stuck out the entire Nazi occupation in Amsterdam, and then afterwards, basically, he was told by the head of the Anthroposophical Society there that he was stepping on his toes and should cease. And Tomberg was asked if he should stop, and he was sort of told, yeah. He wrote to Marie Steiner asking if she wanted him gone, and we have some notes from letters she drafted about him and things she said about him that she never sent to him. So he never got a reply from her. She just ghosted him after being his mentor for decades. It's a little strange. It's a little sad, but it's quite evident that she and the other executive board members of the Anthroposophical Society were extremely threatened by Valentin Tomberg and the fact that most anthroposophists who were hearing his prolific lecturings, his publications, and all of this stuff. And remember, this is in the 30s up to the 40s. So he's really young. That's really young. He didn't really start being an independent spiritual teacher till he turned 40, which is always good advice. The Kabbalists sort of have a thing like that. Steiner was very clear that you could not draw a circle around you to speak directly about spiritual matters without like the medium of a system until you were 40. It's not a shock that I started this school when I was 40. All right, that wasn't like an accident or anything like that. But until that point, it does make sense that you want to have some time in life to learn different techniques, methodologies, disciplines, and schools and see how they work together before you just start saying what you think or what you're, yeah. I don't think I need to explain that to all of us here. We're all over 40, so we all get it. Yeah, it's one of the reasons I didn't continue the Golden Dawn after Temple Tahuti closed on my own or just start a new order at 23 years old. I did get a lot of wisdom from Steiner's ideas, which were presented to me often by teachers in school who saw what I was sort of up to and were like, there's some advice you could get. And the first one is humility. And thank God they did, but also the Golden Dawn. I mean, if you couldn't get down with humility in our order, they made you. That's true. Yeah, and there's certain alchemy stages you go through, especially when you're doing certain rituals where it's designed to inflate the ego so that it can emphasize the weaker points of who we are and draw out our flaws and vices and insecurities so that we can refine them. So, if you fill a kid up or practice an occultist up with like all this, say, Venusian energy, and you get to see the defects in the personality because it's so emphasized in that one regard that you might escape you otherwise. And it's hard to give people advice spiritually if they're guarded, if you don't see them much, if you don't get to know them very well, and if they're given a chance to conceal that stuff without even necessarily knowing it's there themselves, concealing it from ourselves. Like I didn't realize a lot of going through different elemental and alchemical stages, of course, emphasized to me like some defects that I didn't really realize I had. And then, superiors see it and they're like, yeah, so you should do this exercise for 12 hours once a week for the next 6 months and see if that helps. And then you're like, oh, God damn it. What are you talking about? No way. Fasting and long vigils is not every teenager or 20-year-old's ideal situation on a Friday night, right? But hey, that was what I signed up for. So yeah, humility, whether you liked it or not. And it was a good thing. That's actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And Steiner emphasized that from the get-go in his teachings. And what's one of the best criticisms I think Tomberg has of anthroposophy and the followers after Steiner's death was that they spent more time trying to safeguard the uniqueness of Steiner's teachings as an authority rather than doing what Steiner himself said needed to happen, which is have people focus on the techniques and experiences and practices that led to the direct experiences that could constantly act as a regenerative and infusing process for the community and for everyone else in the society, right? So they started just doing what people always seem to do, is turning him into a sort of canonized saint figure. And when people would say to Marie Steiner, for example, like that Tomberg is like, to watch him speak, everyone who watched him speak if you've ever been impressed by any part of his book, this was one of those guys that they said just filled light, he just had a warm, loving presence. And a lot of anthroposophists actually didn't like that his circle of students and stuff were a bit more on the fuzzy, lovey. They even accused him of like erotic spirituality, being upset just by because they were too warm and congenial and loving and friendly, whereas a lot of more German anthroposophical groups were a bit more analytical and cold and Aristotelian. But of course, that's part of Steiner's whole idea, is this idea that the intellectual Aristotelians and the new wave of the Platonic mystics must join together. But the Platonic ones, Steiner said, from his clairvoyant visions, weren't going to come till later in the 20th century, basically to our lifetimes, like around now, from 70s onward, 60s onward, which makes a lot of sense. The early pre-modern and 20th century development of science, right? Einstein, before Einstein, up to Einstein, and up to the splitting of the atom. Very intellectual time in the scientific world. Post 60s, where everyone was dropping acid. Aristotelian and Platonic. We're using these philosophers, and Steiner used these philosophers to represent general greater ideas or currents of relationship within the approach in human life to each other and to spirituality itself. And Steiner said these two things have to fuse in the 20th century, and that will be great. But he also thought that the 20th century would give rise to peace and expression and the true selves of all humans coming forth, and everyone having this sort of beginning of this utopia. In fact, the opening up and the return of Shambhala, which of course is in the center of the earth, because where else would it be, right? I don't know much about Shambhala personally. If any of you guys have any tidbits of interesting knowledge about it, I think they were talking about a spiritual Shambhala, not a physical place. But I think there is a lot to be said about our connection with the earth and the spiritual realms that might exist. The realities we explore, I think they're much more connected with the actual planet than they are necessarily always with the astral or the otherworldly. I think there's a lot to be said from the as below perspective. And I mean, what if all these other realities are generated from the physical instead of the reverse of that? No one ever flips these things on its head, which is one of my favorite things to do as a mental exercise, because it's like, wait a second, yeah, what if light descends from God to the mother and then the father? Flip that around. Ever try just flipping some of the spheres around, or the order, or just flip it all around? That's what people do with the Qliphoth to make their whole Qliphoth system. So there's a lot to be said for breaking these systems down and seeing what ideas emerge when we look at them in different ways. What Steiner and Tomberg didn't anticipate was that this emerging of the I consciousness, and I'm going to wrap up here, and we'll have to do a part 2, of course, sometime, but the merging of the I consciousness in the early 20th century didn't lead to all humans seeing the true higher self in each other and the true I. It led to Ich lehre euch den Übermenschen, der Mensch ist etwas, das überwunden werden soll, was habt ihr getan, ihn zu überwinden? I teach you the Superman. Man is something that should be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? Nietzsche's words, and Nietzsche died in 1900, so you definitely know who he reincarnated as, right? I bet a lot of people thought Tomberg was the reincarnation of Nietzsche. I would not be surprised. But this idea of the Superman got so distorted in the early 20th century because Nietzsche died, but this teaching of the emergence of the I coming forward was something Steiner saw as well. But it didn't emerge in the way people thought. It emerged in Das Reich. It emerged in the idea that the people who know their true self are better than everyone else and should rule them. That's how it emerged in National Socialism, and in a slightly different form in Russia in Bolshevism, right? The idea that the community is the true self, and I mean, the rest is history, literally. So maybe we'll leave it there for now. Any thoughts, feelings, questions, perturbations? We can chit chat for a bit. I hope that was
great.
Was that slightly illuminating? Give some context.
Yeah, very
We're
much.
still recording.
Oh yeah.
I have a question. Wasn't Nietzsche's sister kind of responsible for a lot of that, the way Nietzsche's words got twisted? Because Nietzsche's words
she
with the
deceptively edited
Ubermensch and everything. Yeah, she deceptively edited it, and then pretty much the the Nazis used that as kind of a,
To be
I don't
fair,
know,
I don't think
as
that
part of their.
no, I don't think the Nazis needed her to change any of his
Yeah.
words for them to make their own use of it, right? Like they could do that on their own. But yeah, his sister was crazy and she probably poisoned him to death. Thanks for watching to the end. Let's share some more details about 2026. Our ENOCHIAN conference and spring workshop will be in Austin, Texas, 6th through 8th of November for the ENOCHIAN itself. You can sign up at arcaneresearchsociety.com/2026. But it's not too late also to attend our 2025 course of study, including the December 6th full-day workshop on the practice of Enochian magic with me and Dr. Terry Burns. You can go to enochiacon.com to sign up there. The full-day workshop taught by Frater RC and Dr. Terry Burns will begin at 10 a.m. with a grimoire introductory class followed by a conjuration exercise using the full table, following in the afternoon with a workshop taught by Dr. Terry Burns and an evening roundtable.
Good news! Just because you missed our workshops and presentations live, you can still register for them at arcaneresearchsociety.com and enroll in them as a course of study. This supports our presenters directly and further helps us host more and more events, retreats, workshops, and pilgrimages. The future is magical. Thank you for all the support. This message is indeed from the AI voice of Frater RC. Strange times, my friends. Strange and curious times.